We focus on improving the security infrastructure, security technology, and life safety systems of America's K-12 public schools. It's my honor to moderate this panel this morning. Please let me introduce our amazing panelists who share over 150 years of combined experience. Mo Canady is the Executive Director of the National Association of School Resource Officers, NASRO. As a part of his 25-year career in law enforcement in the state of Alabama, he served the last 12 years as the commander of the School Services Division in his district, which provided services to more than 13,000 students. Mo has also been a law enforcement instructor for over 25 years. Dr. Barbara Ferrer is director of the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health and is a nationally known public health leader with over 30 years of professional experience as a philanthropic strategist, public health director, educational leader, researcher, and community advocate. A former Boston area headmaster, she also served as the chief strategy officer for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, as executive director of the Boston Public Health Commission, and as a director of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. Dr. Erroll is director of the Safe Communities Institute and Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies here at the University of Southern California at the Sol Price School of Public Policy, where he is also a professor of the practice in national and homeland security. Previously, he served as California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's deputy director in the California Office of Homeland Security, as chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for the largest airport police department in America, LA World Airports Police Department, and was President Barack Obama's first nominee to run the Transportation Security Administration. Before academia, Dr. Southers was a special agent with the FBI and a police officer with the Santa Monica Police Department. He's been recognized as one of the top 25 most influential thought leaders by Security Industry Magazine. He is also the author of the book, Homegrown Violent Extremism. And Chief John Thomas is chief of the USC Department of Public Safety, which he has led since 2006. Prior to his appointment, he spent 21 years as a member of LAPD, where he retired at the rank of lieutenant to accept a position as the deputy chief of police for the University of the District of Columbia Department of Public Safety and Emergency Management. Let me open us with a very brief statement. There's no magic bullet to solving the issue of mass violence in our society. As such, there's no single solution that will make our schools safer. Anyone who tells you that they have the gadget, the training program, or the web-based app that will end the scourge of violence in our schools does not fully comprehend the complexity of the issue. Mass incidents in our schools are relatively rare, yet when they happen, they tear at the heart of our society. There is violence in our schools every day that does not involve the definition of mass violence, which is 4 or more people. That said, there are definitely things we can do to make our schools safer. It starts with a dialogue at the local level among all of the key stakeholders and an attitude that it understands it will take a holistic, multifaceted approach that embraces multiple disciplines. We owe it to our children and those who care for them to provide them with a safe, secure, and healthy learning environment. So with that, I'll kick it off with a question to the panel. What do you believe should be a priority in identifying a national response to the challenge of school violence? Mo, why don't you kick us off?
Well, maybe in answering that, I might say, phrase the question a little different way, that what are the priorities? Cool. From my standpoint, obviously, our lane as an association is school policing, school resource officers. And so that's what we're going to talk about the most, certainly, but there are many different layers. There's a lot of discussion about law enforcement's role in the school environment, but we're only one piece of that. We're only one layer of helping to solve this problem or dealing with it, or school safety overall. So from our standpoint, we believe that if one of the priorities is school-based policing, we need to make sure we're doing it the right way. So making it a priority is fine, but let's make sure we're not looking at law enforcement as the sole way to solve this, because we're not going to be able to. But again, a very important layer and a piece of the priority.
Sure, and I want to, just thank everyone for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here, and particularly want to thank Dr. Southers for all his work in this area and his partnership. I think it's really important, and I think we heard one of the priorities from the student panel, which is student engagement. The entire community actually has to be engaged in creating a peaceful environment where everyone gets an opportunity to learn. I would probably focus on making sure that we're supporting students and parents with social and emotional learning opportunities. We're not born knowing skills, how to manage our emotions and how to manage our relationships with each other. And at the heart of creating peace in our schools, in our homes, in our communities is really building healthy relationships. When I was a headmaster in Boston, it wasn't our metal detectors that protected us from violence in the school. It was one strategy, but as many of you know, students who want to get, knives into schools or guns into schools have many other routes besides passing through that front door. What stopped horrific events from happening were students talking to other people in the school building, whether it was the school police or it was a teacher or it was another student or it was the secretary and the receptionist. Building those relationships that allow us to trust each other with sensitive information is what in fact creates safety in our environments. And students know better than anyone else in that building, because there's more of them than there are of anybody else, how in fact to create a thriving community where we in fact manage our relationships in a way that actually builds peace. And for now, I'd also highlight the need for trauma support and trauma-informed communities. Many of us come from communities or from homes where we've experienced a lot of trauma and violence, and we have to create an environment that actually supports students before we penalize students. So, I could talk for a long time, but I'm going to stop there because I think those are two of the most important facets.
Awesome. Thanks. Doug?
Well, Mr. Canady and Dr. Ferrer have spoken to the fact that it has to be interdisciplinary and that there obviously is not one solution to this. I think that there are three real issues that have to be prioritized. The first is one of policy, because we do need a policy that's going to be qualitative and quantitative with regards to the strategy we're going to put forward. And policy only comes from good information. And it wasn't until recently that we actually were able to define what the scope of this problem really is. It's embarrassing that in a recent study that was done on school shootings, if you want to look at shootings, that 0.2% of the schools reported back to the agencies in the way of a survey to give them the data that they use. And so we're operating on making policies and decisions on false information. And as W. Edwards Deming once said, who's a famous data scientist, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So we don't even know what the problem is yet. So that's one issue. And the only way to do that really is to pull people together so we can have evidence-based information of what best practices are. Robert, you and I worked together with the Police Foundation. We did a survey of all 50 states in the country looking at some of the states that mandated security practices and found states that were extraordinary and states where it was really somewhat almost non-existent. And so that's an issue. The second one is education. And teachers, students, parents, educators, community leaders don't really have the information to make those decisions that people like Dr. Ferrer make in the health industry with regards to what a challenged student really is going through. How do I identify them? How do we respond to them? And once we do respond to them, how do we in a holistic way get them to sustain their ability to go to school, function in their environment, and do those kinds of things? And then last but not least is outreach, where we really have to centralize our efforts. And that's the reason that we're pushing a national center. We need a centralized effort that's going to be able to collect and analyze the information that we get so it can be disseminated to the appropriate partners, that they can use it and deploy it in a way that's effective. And most importantly, then once we've got that baseline, measure it in a way that we can determine whether it's effective or not. And so we really have some work to do, but we're not going to do this in a vacuum. As Dr. Ferrer said, it is a community approach, and you won't have a safe school unless you have a safe community.
Well, at the risk of being redundant, I almost want to say ditto. But the reality is this is a very complex issue. It has been a complex issue for many years. And I think the approaches have been overly simplistic. these mass violent incidents did not just occur. The reality is, by the time it gets to law enforcement, it's almost too late. Our jobs are pretty much defined as to what our roles are in those emergency situations. However, there has to be more focus on, as Dr. Ferrer said, looking at what are the precursors, what are the things that trauma induced communities and individuals that walk into places like schools. And we can't just limit it to just schools, because the reality is it's happened in every place that we at one time thought were safe places in America: churches, movie theaters. And as it's more prevalent, or seems to be, from my perspective, in campuses and universities, the reality is it runs a gamut. So I do believe that the approaches have to be holistic. They have to look at more than what is the law enforcement response, and have to look at what are the ways that we can identify and assess these potential threats prior to the individual acting out in those ways. Oftentimes well, I know for school settings, for the most part, we know what we're dealing with the student population. And oftentimes there are precursors, there are things that can be identified by teachers, by peers. And I don't think we pay enough attention to those things. I think after the incidents, there's a lot of digesting and dissecting of how this occurred, why it occurred, and even the motivations. But the reality is we need to be just as proactive on the front end than we are on the back end after the tragedies. By that point, we have a lot of information, but that information existed prior to as well. We just don't have the processes to identify and deal effectively with them.
It seems that whenever an incident happens, particularly a mass incident, like I said, it tears at our heartstrings. We know statistically that virtually 100% of the mass incidents that have happened in elementary schools were committed by intruders. 96% adults, 6% youth, but an intruder being defined as a person who had no business being on that campus. We know in the secondary schools, it's 25 to 35% of those mass incidents. Again, the definition of a mass incident is 4 or more. But we have violence in our schools every day. And it is a complex challenge, and it is a multifaceted, multidisciplined approach. But those of us who interface with policymakers and legislators, their immediate reaction is always, well, what are the teachers going to do? Or what's law enforcement going to do? And we don't even like to use law enforcement, we like to use police, because you do so much more than just enforce laws. You're rescuers. But what are they missing? What are the legislators and the policymakers missing when they address this complex challenge? What should we be telling them? They automatically run to, what's it going to cost? And what are the teachers going to do? And what are the police going to do? What should we be telling them? Doc?
You know, I think this is a great question with no real easy answer. Because I think it is, again, multifaceted. And you know, and I do want to pick up on something that was said earlier about it. It's really hard to separate school violence from community violence as well. You know, when I was working in a school, I had 2 students who, while I was there, committed murder. Not on the school premises, but outside of the school in the community. And if you had asked any of the teachers or administrators in my building to pick out 2 young people who they thought were capable of killing somebody else, those 2 students' names would never have come to the top of the list, ever. Wow. They weren't disruptive, they didn't disobey rules, they took their hats off, they put their phones away, they weren't doing well academically, and they weren't necessarily connected well socially, but they weren't troublemakers in the school environment. And I highlight that because that's the piece I think we miss. We act as if these incidences are isolated and they're bad actors. And I would say, you know, what there are inattentive adults who haven't really created a framework where all children thrive and where we're able to build peace. And we're going to miss the boat if we continue to focus on what's the reaction to the absolute most horrific event of violence, which is mass shooting in a school building, and fail to go back to what I think you've been talking about, Robert, all along, which is that there's violence every day in many of our school buildings. Young people are bullied. There's a lot of discrimination. We can't forget about the impact of racism, both historical and continuing acts of discrimination and bias. We can't forget about what's happening in people's homes that they're bringing into the school building. And if we don't sort of balance the approach to how will we manage in a mass shooting incident with how will we manage to build peace in our school community and our homes and our neighborhoods, we're going to miss the boat on really making sure that what we have in schools are safe environments where everyone gets to learn. You know, so I would ask us to not just focus on gun legislation, which I think is critically important, not to just focus on mental health services for those young people who are really struggling with an illness, but to focus on the fact that oftentimes relationships are not healthy. And we have hurt people that have no ability to manage that hurt except to hurt other people. And we're going to have to fix that problem. And as adults, we have to really step it up. We have to both be modeling and providing opportunities to build our skills and the skills of our students so that they can, in fact, handle conflict in a nonviolent way, so that they feel like there's somewhere else to turn when they feel like they have no options. I had way too many students who would say to me, you know, I'm into the preemptive strike. I'm threatened, I'm going to hit first. And the only thing they knew was to fight. And, you know, this is a high school, so we obviously failed in preparing those students with other ways to manage that conflict.
Good. Erroll?
Well, Dr. Ferrer is absolutely right. And let me just say this with regards to the question about what legislators are missing. I looked at this, and we've talked about this before. To me, this is as much a Homeland Security problem as anything else. The numbers should suggest that. So having said that, what mistakes have we made in the past that we haven't learned our lesson from? When Homeland Security was first stood up, we decided to throw a lot of money at it. And mathematically speaking, what we did in Homeland Security is we gave every state the same amount of money. Well, every state doesn't face the same kind of threat, nor does any school. So to that point, Homeland Security finally pulled back and looked at risk. They looked at threats, they looked at vulnerabilities, they looked at consequences that would total up to a formula that gave them a risk quotient. So without an assessment, if we want to speak to the physical piece of this, which as I understand now with some of the funding that's going out there, we're probably talking about either personnel or toys or equipment, we really have to look at the ability to have assessments done across the board to see what schools need. Not every school needs an armed police officer. Not every school needs a metal detector. There are obvious resources that are going to be missing if we do it that way, and we've done that before. And I'm disappointed to see that it seems like we're going that way again. So I think legislators need to step back, understand that this is a holistic problem that we really have to think about when you're going to give funding to areas, understand what it's going to, and then most importantly, how are we going to measure the effectiveness of this funding that's given out? I mean, it's hard to, as they say, deal with the counterintuitive, counterfactual hypothesis where you're trying to measure prevention. That's essentially what we're doing. So once we do that, is there going to be a baseline that we can say, oh, this is working? And if it works in New Jersey, can it work in Texas? And that's the other thing, is coming up with evidence-based best practices that are able to be replicated, because things do work in different areas, but there is no cookie-cutter approach to this. But I'm just disappointed that legislators have responded in a way that's predictable, with lots of funding, and people will compete for it, and we'll just repeat the errors of the initial stages of the Department of Homeland Security when we try to address the national security threat to our country.
Good. Chief?
Well, over my 34 years now in law enforcement, I've seen a full circle, and I'll echo what Dr. Ferrer said. We have to look at what are the things that are causing the dysfunction in communities. mental health is one piece of it, but you've got whole communities that are struggling, that are disenfranchised, that unless you get at the root of the dysfunctional schools in the first place in some places, we're never going to get at it. You know, to the tune of 30,000 Americans every year lose their lives to gun violence. And we're at a point now where there's these school shootings once a week. And you look at other nations around the globe, and the reality is this is an American problem. And I think we have to get at the root of the issue. And I know the policy has to match where we are going as a society. What do we really value? Do we really value wholesome communities? Do we really value getting at the root of why these incidents occur in the first place? Because the policies will never catch up to that unless that's addressed. And I think, you know, I always caution myself and I caution others when I think about this. It is a very complex. These are very complex issues because when you look at the profile, if there is such a profile, and I don't think there is, the reality is we have more information relative to after these incidences occur as to what, because as the doctor mentioned, the individuals she spoke of, no one knew or suspected that they were capable. And that's usually what oftentimes is the case. But then when you start peeling back the layers and you look at the communities, the households, and then also just the relative ease it is to get weapons of violence. So the reality is there's a lot more work to be done there and a lot more investment that has to be made prior to and into I would say communities that have struggled socioeconomically, but that's no longer the case because when you look across the landscape where these incidences are occurring, it doesn't matter. So I think the investment has to be into addressing some of the cultural issues in communities, in schools prior to, because once it's occurred, it's pretty much from the perspective of law enforcement, our roles are pretty much defined. We were talking earlier about getting back to the relationship nature of just law enforcement. I'll just take that as because that's what I know best. But the reality is we're going back to that point where communities are expecting to know the officers that patrol their community. They want them out of their police cars. They want them to be able to identify in advance what are the issues in the community, who are the people that are causing some of the issues. Just a familiarity that once existed that prevented a lot of things from happening because you had relationships built with those first line individuals to government, which is the police. So the reality is we're now going back, and I'm glad to see that law enforcement is, but I do think that that's one way to get to the root of prior to is that familiarity with law enforcement, other first responders, for public health at the beginning. And the legislators start listening to these individuals.
Well, Mo, I think the chief has teed up the community policing role of NASRO.
I would agree.
Talk about it.
I would agree, and I hope that no one is going to come and roll my chair away from this table because what I'm going to do, once again, as I did with your first question, is I'm going to turn the question inside out a little bit, and I apologize for that. But what concerns me more about the question, what are legislators missing, is more what are they doing that might be a knee-jerk response, an overreaction, and a rush to judgment. And so, you know, since things began to kind of come unglued February 14th on forward, I've seen some of that, and that concerns us as an association. You know, we've seen the push, certainly in some areas, to arm teachers. And that's, you know, that phrase, that's a pretty broad statement. which we don't think is a good idea. That's I think most teachers don't want to be armed. So in terms of what are they missing, well, this is maybe one thing that I think requires a little more thought. And I know that there are areas where schools feel vulnerable, where law enforcement response is a long way off. I think about a school administrator I was sitting with a few years ago at a meeting in Washington, D.C., and we were all talking about transportation issues and keeping kids safe getting to school. And again, he's from Wyoming, and he says, well, no one's telling me how to keep kids safe riding their horses to school. So again, we've got areas that law enforcement response can be a long way off. So there is that. I see and kind of get the knee-jerk reaction, and I think there are some well-meaning people that have these kind of discussions. But yes, the chief did kind of tee it up, because I am very pro law enforcement in schools if it's done the right way.
Talk about that.
I've always been a big proponent of community-based policing. And so if we're going to put police in schools, it's got to be a community-based policing approach. NASRO stands firmly on that idea. There's a definition, a federal definition of what an SRO is. And this is something that we've had to deal with constantly, because people have a misunderstanding of what an SRO is. There's three things in there that are really important. They're a sworn certified law enforcement officer, and I add to that, they need to be a veteran officer. This is not a place for a brand new police officer to go into a school. Secondly, it has to be community-based policing. That's within the definition. It's the foundation of it. And then thirdly, it has to be a collaborative effort between the school district and law enforcement agency. Take any of those three things away, and it's going to be a failure. If we're putting police in schools just to stop school shootings, we're going to fail in that. If we're putting police in schools just to solve a gang problem, we're going to fail. Now, all that to say, we certainly are not perfect at this, but we've done a lot of things over the last couple of decades to really make this a better process. And understanding that the number one goal of any officer working in a school should be to bridge the gap between law enforcement and youth. What does that do for active shooter situations or mass violence situations? It gives us the opportunity to be proactive and to prevent things through really valuable intelligence. And my law enforcement friends up here will tell you, the intelligence you get through positive relationships is so much more valuable than the old snitch route. And you can count on that intelligence. And if you do your job as a law enforcement officer and investigate that, you can save lives. And when we talk about the National Police Foundation and their work in the Averted School Violence Project, we're learning more and more stories, not just of SROs, but of other law enforcement officers, school principals who have shared information and stopped that act of violence before the shot was ever fired.
Can I, before we go on, can I because I think this is a great conversation. I've really appreciated so much wisdom, I think, on this panel. I want to just go back to the two students in my school and, sort of the failure on the part of adults, but also the failure on the part of how we think about solutions. I just, deep in my heart, I know that had there been people in our school building who had good, deep relationships with those two young people, they probably would have never murdered anybody. And I don't really see anybody fighting hard, except for the people in those buildings, the teachers, the administrators, the students, for the kinds of resources that actually make a difference in the lives of kids whose lives are phenomenally complicated.
Talk about those.
So, in my mind, I'm just going to talk about my school, 350 kids, one guidance counselor, one, whose real job was to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to go to college. And that's, there's 350 students, that's a big job. Really, no capacity to actually provide mental health support. And then I had a community relations person. And his job really was to build relationships with students, to find out what kinds of needs they had, and to try to provide support before there were issues. One person, 350 kids in my school, 98% of the students qualified for free lunch. I had children, students from all across the world, but predominantly it was students who were immigrants. They had just come to this country, or they were the first generation in this country. Their families didn't necessarily speak English. Everybody was struggling with huge issues in their own lives. So I walked in thinking 25% of my students would have complicated lives. The reality was 75% of my students would have complicated lives. Lives so complicated that most of us would not get out of bed and show up at school. Homelessness, living in horrible situations, not with kin, but with sort of an extended family relationship that they had somehow been sent to this country, where they were serving mostly as caregivers to other people in the household. And I had no capacity or resources in that school budget to address the kind of support that students need. It was really hard to fundraise for those resources, but that's what I was left to do, was to actually, as a headmaster, raise $1 million a year to provide supportive services in my school building for students. And we also weren't necessarily looking at how we could really support young people to be leaders, particularly in a high school environment, and provide peer-to-peer support. So we were missing the boat on that. We were missing the boat on governance. We started a student council, and so these are 9th through 12th graders. And after everyone was elected, when I was talking with them, not one single student in my school who was elected had ever served on a governance board in their entire academic careers. So all of the schools, different schools that they came from, they had never participated in any kind of leadership effort. They had never helped form policies, advise the headmaster or the principals on, what would make the school a thriving place from their perspective. Those are our failures. And if I were to look back, I would say, suspending students, expelling students, those are last resorts. Kicking young people out of our buildings, that should not be the way we approach problems that are happening. We really need more services that actually address the needs of young people who have very complicated lives.
Anybody else want to add?
I'm sorry.
Sure. No, go right ahead.
And I really appreciate you saying that. When I was an SRO, and it was the greatest part of my career, our best friends in the school were the clinical intervention specialists, mental health folks that we could lean on for better understanding in terms of what's going on. And so it's so important, especially when law enforcement comes into that role, that they become part of a kind of a larger safety team and have those other resources around them. School counselors and other mental health specialists are invaluable to us in what we do.
And I would add also, anytime you put an officer in any environment like that, they are only going to be as effective as they are at those relationships. And I'll talk a little bit about relationship nature of public safety and the officers that are not just serving in schools, but everywhere. And I think you touched upon it, Mo, when you mentioned that's the best source of information or intelligence. But to the degree that we change the measures of effectiveness in law enforcement, and I do think that is happening. It's happening slowly. And of course, don't get me wrong, there will be people that will be incarcerated, that need to be incarcerated for the betterment of communities. But the measure of effectiveness has to get to a place where it really is about building relationships. Because for most of my career, I've seen where the law enforcement experts decide what's most important for a community. What I've learned in the last 10, 15 years is that unless the community identifies what the issues are for that community, we're not going to be effective. And oftentimes, the issues, as was mentioned earlier, of incarcerating and enforcement as the sole model for how we address these issues, we're going to continue to be behind the curve. So I like to use the term relationship based policing, because that's where it's going. That's what it is. Because you ask your average cop, what does community-based policing? Each cop is going to give you a different definition and interpretation of what that means to them. But when you break it down to the most simple concept, and that is that one of the primary roles of law enforcement in a democratic society is to build those relationships and have avenues by which you can get information relative to what's going on in that community, because you're not going to find out the trauma-induced factors that cause crime in those communities unless you have relationships with the individuals, and unless you're plugged into public health, mental health, homeless interventionists, gang interventionists. Law enforcement has to get to a point where it's a team effort, and that team doesn't solely consist of the law enforcement officers and the criminal justice processes and system, but all those individuals that actually make for a more healthy, wholesome community.
Great points, and Dr. Ferrer has pointed to the lack of resources available to schools for mental health, and the reliance that we have on police that are in schools to help fill out some of that role. But you don't take a cop off the gangbang squad or off the SWAT team and then throw him into a school. What are the characteristics that we ought to be looking for? And I guess I'm tossing this back to you, Mo, in terms of what kind of people, if we're going to rely on community-based policing in our schools to be an effective tool in communicating with administrations and being a bridge with students, what are the characteristics we ought to be looking at? What kinds of people, what kinds of training?
This is like a three-legged stool, all right? So the first part of this is it's got to be a veteran officer within our department. And guess what? When we select veteran officers, we've got history with them. We know what they're made out of. We're able to look at their jacket and see what's going on there. So it's got to be a veteran officer, hopefully within our own department. Second thing, though.
So some you would exclude.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh,
want to be clear.
Certainly.
Okay.
This is not for everybody. This is the most unique assignment in law enforcement. You put a police officer in an educational world, that can be a collision if you don't manage this properly. So it has to be a veteran officer. The second thing is they've got to be carefully selected, very carefully selected. And there are some things to look at there. You know, we certainly want people who have been good role models in their career so far, who are people of good character, but we also want to look at what kind of interaction have they had with youth. Have they volunteered in coaching youth sports? Have they been Boy Scout and Girl Scout leaders? Have they done those kind of things? And that gives us even more people maybe to chat with about what their roles were like in that particular area. The third thing is they have to be specially trained to work in this environment. Your law enforcement academy training, that's great, we all need it, but that doesn't work for the officer that's going to work in a school environment. That's the foundation. But now we've got to train them specifically. We've got to train them about things like understanding the teen brain process, adolescent brain development. We've got to make sure they have a grasp of that. We've got to make sure that they know some things about mental health issues. We've got to make sure that they have some foundational understanding of special education issues in a school environment. So it really is, and I love the way you put it, relationship-based policing. I may start using that if you don't mind.
Thank you. We all steal that and credit.
Because again, it's the number one goal is to build relationships and bridge that gap.
Erroll, I know you're down to jump in.
I'd just like to piggyback on Mo's comments. I mean, I think it's also important that those officers, when possible, reflect the demographic of the student body. Robert and I worked on a school in a city that, and I won't identify them because they were identified in a national magazine as the most dangerous city in America. And we went there, and one of the things we obviously did was work with the local police department, and we put a female officer in there who happened to be African American. But more importantly, as we were building that process, we took advantage of space that was going to be in a new school. And I asked Robert, I said, well, what are you going to do with that room over there? He says, well, it's going to be a storage room. I said, this is a cold climate. Police officers don't necessarily want to go to the station to write a report. Why don't you give that office to some officers? So first, the motorcycle officers, the motor officers showed up. Then the special weapons officers started showing up, leaving their vehicles outside. That became the most protected piece of real estate outside the police department. But more importantly, those kids got to interact with those officers every single day, and not only at times of trouble.
We actually put in the lease with the police department a requirement that they would interact with the kids, whether it was eating lunch or conduct classes or show and tells, but just to build that relationship between the officers coming and going.
And so Robert called me one day early on in the process and said, you know, we had a kid who reported to a teacher that another student had a weapon. And everybody in the administration wanted to deem that a failure. I said, no, that's a huge success. Absolutely. And they reacted totally diametrically opposed to the way we wanted them to, because they were ready to discipline this kid, not the one who brought the weapon, but the one who talked about it. I said, no, that's the absolute wrong thing to do. That means the system worked, and they felt comfortable. And if we go to the student panel we had prior to this one today, that's a huge part of the problem, is that trust issue. You know, I spent some time with the students who were on our panel earlier today, and they said, you know, we're at a point right now in this country where we don't know if we talk about something, if we're to be taken seriously. Whether it's physical violence, online violence, threats from people, as they've told me, that from people they don't even know. And that's a huge problem. And to your point, Dr. Ferrer, I mean, if you've got people in the school that they can talk to, but then the students feel like, geez, it's just going to be me saying something to them and it goes into a file, that's a huge part of the problem.
And you know, this is an important conversation. We do have a couple other questions we want to get to, but talk about the role of ongoing training. You guys are involved with the managing of a campus and with officers from all over the country. Also want to be clear that everybody that's called an SRO in this country has not been specifically selected and specifically trained.
That's right, and that's why we're so adamant about following that definition and following the guidelines and really the best practices for how to establish this, because there are many times that someone calls me about an SRO that did something, and when I start asking about their role, I realize they don't even come close to fitting the definition. So we have to be specific about that.
And I would say that's my experience as well. I mean, you have some great school police officers, and you have some terrible school police officers, and you know, and I would say the same for everybody in that building. You have some great administrators. You have some administrators that aren't great. You have some great teachers. You have other teachers who actually don't belong in the school building. And I do like that we have focused on training. I mean, training doesn't change everything, but training gives everyone an opportunity to grow their skills and take some responsibility for learning some new things and new ways to be effective in an environment. And in the absence of that, you know, we're all doomed to have some failures, and we're all doomed to actually address challenges in ways that aren't necessarily productive. So, you know, I would say that the training piece is school-wide. You know, and building those teams. I mean, I loved what you said earlier, that you know, the way this works best is if there's a team, and that the training is done to actually amplify the effectiveness of the teams that are in the building. And everyone can play a different role. But together, you really are everyone sort of based on this notion that, you know, we all have a responsibility to build relationships with the people who are in this building, all of us. You know, the teacher, the receptionist, the school police, the headmaster, the principal. And there are students that will gravitate towards different people to build those relationships. So if everyone has training about how to have respectful, productive relationships, and the school policies support an environment that recognizes the impact of trauma, that understands adolescent development and child development, that deals with sort of restorative justice as opposed to punitive justice, you know, you're way ahead of the game then. In terms of creating peace in that community.
I would add to that, when I think of the way most police departments and certainly the way most officers see training, they want to do the fun stuff, and the reality is they want to do the tactical stuff. They want, you know, and at the end of the day, we are responsible for securing those campuses, and we're responsible for keeping people safe. But we have to emphasize those other very important aspects of training that can prevent us from having to utilize our tactics for an active assailant encounter. For instance, mental health. That's a big piece of, what an officer needs to know. The early developmental stages of adolescence. Those are things that we don't train, and I think we need to look at what are the measures of effectiveness for a campus officer. Because coming from a municipal to a campus environment, totally different types of policing. And if you go back to what we were talking about, building relationships, it's critical. And so much of our training does not include the young people that it's impacting. As I listened to the panel prior to, it would be great if they were a part of the training, if they were a part of how we set up the training, because they're the ones that we're responsible for protecting, but we're also expecting them to do certain things too, to know certain things.
So if I were to ask the question of what do we all agree is the best practice, training?
I would say modified. When I hear the word training, I hear it from the law enforcement perspective. I actually like, education. I mean, and officers need to get more accustomed to getting away from training and seeing it a certain way to educating ourselves regarding what do we need to know to be much more effective and smarter in our response. And that entails understanding mental health. That understands getting to know the people that you're responsible for. So education.
Erroll?
I would have to agree it's education and awareness. I also think that we've got to go back to the baseline of assessments and having schools understand what their challenges are, both physically, their human challenges, their cyber challenges, so that they can make informed decisions about what their practice is going to be before we even call it a best practice. I really think those elements are critical.
Good. Doc?
I'm going to, divert a little bit, because I'm going to say it's actually engagement. That's a best practice. Engagement of parents, engagement with students, engagement with faculty, engagement with everybody who's in that learning community, and building some kind of democracy. There has to be opportunities for people's voices who we're in service of to be lifted up and front and center. And I don't think that happens unless it's either parents and students whose voices are lifted up and front and center. So, I do think we have to go back to sort of the engagement belief that's at the heart and soul of building democracy, and I think it's at the heart and soul of building peace.
Well,
I never liked, as an SRO, zero tolerance policies. And I remember voicing my opposition to that one day to the wrong person, or maybe it was the right person, I don't know. And the response I got was, well, we have to have that because we can't trust all of our administrators to make the right judgment call in every circumstance. And I'm like, really? I was stunned by that. And so, and maybe this is not exactly a best practice, but my point, not just in police officers, but in educators, as you said, and others, we need the absolute best people in the world working in school with our students every day. The best people in the world. And you were talking
teachers, counselors,
everybody.
Campus police. Got it.
We need the best of the best. And so how do we back up and encourage people, good folks, to get involved in education on the front end? It was something I never thought about going to college, that I would want to major in education. But the thing is, you talked about the training that a lot of our law enforcement folks like to go to, the fun stuff. But that, and I hate to call it fun stuff, the tactical training. We do need in schools, when we're talking about a law enforcement officer, I want the absolute best tactical person in the world in there, but I also want the person that can do great informal counseling with a student and engage and build relationships. And so what I'm asking for is tough, I understand, but we need the best people in the world with our students every day.
Well, I guess you have the last word. I want to thank all of our panelists for today. We want to thank the Dr. Southers and the Safe Communities Institute for pulling this together. It's an important dialogue. This is a start. We hope we do many, many more of these around the country, bringing together voices, because there are a lot of people that wouldn't have fit at this table today. So thank you for being with us.